these games and how you can have the builds and you can have your plans, but the execution is going to be messy pretty much every time. You could say the primary objective of playing a match against the opponent is to put them outside their comfort zone and to cut them down wherever they're weak. So practicing your builds in a laboratory setting, just an empty custom game, is really great, but the latter setting, you kind of have to be more fluid with your decision making and be wary of how to adjust to the opponents. So we'll kind of skim the notes to start. First paragraph is basically just explaining the main differences between Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void in terms of how the economy works, in terms of the amount of resource per base. Hatcheries give 6 supply as opposed to 2 from Heart of the Swarm, so the rate of expansion is further incentivized to accelerate based on that change. And then the wholly fabled and world-renowned Liberator is an incredibly powerful unit that really changes the strength of Mutalisk in the matchup in large numbers. So to kind of go story mode in Wings of Liberty and HOTS, LingBaneMuta was a very exciting and classic composition to go for against Terran, and you could sort of snowball the Muta count about as high as you could afford. Some players, like I think Moonglade, was pretty well known for going up to like 50 mutas and just destroying stuff. If the Terran ever got a really strong army, you could just avoid them and kind of run away from taking a main fight. Legacy of the Void with the Liberator, Terran has a very cheap and cost-effective way of dealing with large numbers of muta, so that's definitely something to account for. In the most recent balance patch, Corruptors were buffed against Liberators, but Mutalisks are the same, which basically incentivizes the Zerg player to identify as early as they can when the Terran is going to be massing Liberators, and then to transition themselves to Corruptors. Yeah, you could also do push to talk if you wanted. But one thing that I learned from day 9 that's still true today is the convergence point for LingBaneMuta production. A lot of players will have an idea of what types of units they want to make, but they aren't quite aware of what infrastructure you need to sustain that production over time. So for like a 1-1 roach timing, basically 2 bases saturated and you're good to go. For LingBaneMuta, in a way that you can continue to trade with the Terran opponent and replenish your forces and push back, you want to have about 3.5 bases of minerals with 5 to 8 gases depending on the stage of the game. So it's a much higher economy army composition, and it's filled with fragile and fast units. So it takes a while to learn, and it's definitely not forgiving to play. I listed out some basic benchmarks of what constitutes the convergence point, and then this lesson will basically be a variety of approaches to get into the convergence point and how to think about dealing with Terran aggression in various stages of the game. So I already touched on that note about Liberators. The builds, I don't need to go step by step with all of these, you're very capable of reading those. But one thing to bear in mind is the most effective approach for employing some combination of LingBaneMuta is largely map dependent. So Dusk Towers, say for example, is a map that's very popular, and it's a very macro-oriented map with a tiny choke to defend 2 bases. So the aggressive build, where you use speedlings to deny an expansion, is totally non-viable. You could bust the front, because usually they'll have 2 depots, and then if you're lucky, an add-on, you could blow that up with 5 banes and then kind of muscle through. But speedling pressure with the intention of denying a CC is going to be best on maps with a wide open natural expansion that's as short a rush as it can be. So Frozen Temple would be the ideal map for this aggressive build. And then the Tilia approach to ZvT LingBaneMuta is a gasless opener, which means you have a bit more economy early on. It can be a little bit more dicey against Reaper, but you squeeze out more drones, which means you can make mutas a bigger part of your emphasis in the composition, rather than LingBane. So the notes are kind of a reference. We can touch on them as we go, but start by hopping into a game. Let's get something that's really standard to begin with. Yeah. Marine Mine Drop into Liberator into Biomine Medivac. Super, super common. Starting on Frost. So the Marine Mine Drop is incredibly popular currently. There are a lot of different ways that Terran can open, but this opener is very cheap. It gives the Terran a really good read. It involves a stealth unit, the Widow Mine, once it's burrowed, and Stim Marines can give you a pretty bad time. So I believe this time I opted for a Hatch Gas Pool opener, so I'm playing as standard as you possibly can. One thing to mention, the reason Hatch Gas Pool is the standard Zerg build is because the hatch, the gas, and the pool pieces all happen when you have one base minimum saturation. Hatch for economy and production, gas so you have a fast unit that can do things in the game, and then the pool so you can make queens and lings and move along the tech tree. Four lings is usually sufficient. Thinking about micro against the Reaper in the early stage, ideally you want to think about punishing the Reaper for attacking your drones and not chasing the Reaper away from your bases. The Reaper's going to be taking the best trades off of creep, and still decent trades with lings on creep before ling speed is done. So really kind of using queens as the zoning unit and lings as the punishing unit if the Reapers try to leap in and shoot your drones. Same thing applies for like 3 racks and more of Reaper.
So when your queen popped there, is it better to attack the Reaper immediately with the queen or wait to inject first?
You want to inject first. Queen DPS is very, very low, and injecting is sort of the progression of your economy and your strength later on. It's pretty much always going to be better to keep that macro cycle going rather than kind of place a bet that the Terran's going to mess up and lose the Reaper. A couple queen shots, the Reaper can just retreat, and then its passive ability is that it heals when it's out of combat. So they've delayed your macro to trade a little bit of health that they're just going to recover later. Short answer, injecting is better. One benchmark to kind of put in front of you, this applies to all matchups. 2 bases of mineral saturation is when you want to start scaling up your gases. So I was on 1 gas with only 1 worker mining until I had 2 base mineral, and then I refilled the gas in my main and took 2 gases at my natural, started the Evo chambers, made a spore. 5-minute spore is generally a good timing. Making it a bit earlier isn't that big of a deal. One fundamental skill to work on with Zerg that definitely applies to LingBaneMuta is having a hotkey for creep queens, so there's no confusion between which queens are injecting and which queens are spreading creep. In the early game stages like this, sometimes you'll use the queens to like focus the medivac, as in this case, but then you want to figure out after the engagement what the roles are for the various queens. Cleaned up pretty easily. And then something that's mentioned in the notes, gas spending is something to think about how you're prioritizing in the game. It's generally bad to be floating lots of gas unless you have a clear plan of how that's about to be spent. So a mutaflock would be an example, or a round of infestors, or a bunch of ultras or something. And then the rough prioritization would basically be tech and upgrades, and then your Spire units or your Ultras if you have them, and then you would make Banes last. with this sort of Liberator harassment, first of all, just as an aside, this is one of the most mentally frustrating things in all of Legacy of the Void right now, so just make peace with that. We can't change it, the Liberator's strong, it's been like this since the beta, it's been nerfed a couple times, but this Spore Liberator interaction, it's going to be tough, but it does cost the Terran some attention, so you can kind of rest assured that their macro is not going to be perfect at home either when they're devoting a lot of attention to sieging your line and then dodging the Spore, unsieging, all that stuff. So just try to keep your workers alive, try to be quick with the readjustment of the Spore position. If the Liberator is unsieged, you can leave the Spore unsieged and kind of wait and see where they go and set up, and then you can root the Spore. In general, it's always better to lose some mining time rather than lose a worker. These little drones that have been roasted will never mine a single mineral again for the rest of the game. But these drones, they stopped mining for a moment, but now they can get back to work. Much better to transfer them to a different base or stop them, move them away, whatever they have to. One pretty crucial thing right now, despite all this shenaniganry with this Liberator in the main, the army is positioned at the watchtower. So that's going to give me plenty of notice if there's about to be an engagement. Basically at this point, and then this Ling at the lower watchtower, I'll see as soon as move-outs are going to happen. So rather than have a bunch of standing banelings, I can just have a bunch of Lings, which are really fast, be forward with them on the map, and then when a big push is coming, I can fall back and then make a bunch of banes if I need to. But here, I had a bunch of Lings, and generally, if you have a bunch of fighting units, especially if they're fast fighting units, just go across the map, see what's up. A lot of times an opponent will leave an opening because, like in this case, they were focusing super hard on their Liberator control, keeping those alive, and then they were focused on sending a drop across the map. There are a lot of these windows in ZvT where either the Zerg player sends their army across, or the Terran player commits a lot of units to medivacs. War involves lots of risk. This is a risk that the Terran player took. They have 2 medivacs, only 2 medivacs in the whole game. And they have 3 Widow Mines. 2 of the Widow Mines are in this medivac, so this is pretty much all of their fighting force. They have a few stray units at home, but they're very vulnerable in this small window. Life is, or was, one of the best Zerg players in the matchup because he would always have some Ling presence near the opponent's base, and whenever they would give a small opening like that, he would just fill it with some Lings, which are really cost-effective units.
I mean, you've given yourself a pretty decisive economy lead there.
Yeah. That's a really crucial aspect to ZvT. Other matchups, but especially ZvT, is the player who can make workers faster, defend that worker lead, and then use that worker lead to make more stuff, is usually going to be coming out ahead. We see in the big tournaments the amazing micro and splitting on the fly of these great players, but the more subtle way to get ahead, and the more solid you could say, is just making drones faster than they can make SCVs, taking your third before they take their third, taking your fourth before they take their fourth, and just making units the entire game. The Zergling is incredibly cost efficient. It's only 50 minerals and you get 2 of them. There are units like the Liberator, when they do their attack, it deals more damage than the Lings have in HP. So the Lings absorb damage in a really effective way. The main limitation of the Zergling is that it's incredibly larva inefficient. So you need to be really on top of your injects and or have a bunch of bases to support Ling production. But it's sort of the unsung hero of the LingBaneMuta composition. It's the one that usually ends up doing the most work in terms of counterattacks. The Zergling is also the tank of the army, since it ends up soaking the majority of the damage. It benefits from upgrades better than any other unit. It's just all around amazing. So basically think about your saturation goal, say 67 to 75. Once you get in that range, a lot of your mineral income, pretty much all of it that's not spent in tech or mutas, spend it into Lings. Have some Lings countering, have some Lings defending drops, have some Lings in the main army doing work.
Would it have been a good idea here, since you were floating minerals and spending all your larvae anyway, to add on more queens to handle the Liberator early on?
Yeah, that would be a good idea. You can see in the units tab right now, I only have 3 queens. As a general rule, you should have at least 3 queens injecting, and then another 2 at minimum spreading creep. So right now I'm below that amount, and as you mentioned, I was floating minerals. That's the perfect time to remake queens. Another thing about StarCraft in general is energy units gain value the longer they're in the game. The queen is an energy unit, as are medivacs. So whenever you lose queens, you want to think about instantly remaking them as you can afford them. And one of the reasons why mutas prioritize medivacs over bio is because by killing the medivac, you prevent all that future healing and energy growth of the unit. One thing that's mentioned in the notes, using the steal function to split off a run by group. This set of units here, you can see is on my 3rd control group. I just boxed some stuff. It wasn't really like a super calculated move. I just wanted to have a small portion of my army with a little bit of diversity, so I have 2 banes with the group. Send it kind of down, straight down, away from the main attack lane, and then rallied over into the opponent's 3rd. So it's a very simple move, and with the steal function, you don't even need to rebind your army. They're already removed. And then you can just think about having a clean defense on your side of the map with some pre-split LingBane. At this point, I basically feel safe enough to tech to Hive. The Hive tech transition is something that doesn't necessarily need to happen. If you're being very dominant with LingBaneMuta, sometimes you can just roll back and kill the opponent. So sensing when that's a possibility, and then capitalizing, is really good to develop. But the Ultra is a very, very strong unit in the game. So if you feel like you have map control, and you aren't sure if you can kill the opponent, tech to Ultra. Infestors are sort of an optional piece. As a note, if you only want to make 2 or 3, don't take pathogen glands. You can use 2 or 3 infestors for your push with ultras later on. You can also have more infestors in your composition, like 6 to 8 is a good amount. If you take that many, take the pathogen glands upgrade and take burrow. Burrow is going to increase the survivability of your infestors and also give you the option to go for burrowed banes. And you can save drones if you're being attacked.
So what triggers you to make the decision to spend gas into infestors instead of, say, more ultras or broodlords?
So thinking about the size of units and the ability to close a game, ultras are a really good unit for, say, killing this base. I don't know if pings are working when it's over. Basically the 4th of the Terran and the 3rd of the Terran. You can kill those bases very reliably with ultras. They're big open attack paths, no problem. But if you want to push into the main, say they have some bio, maybe some tank, in all these choked up areas, it's only like 1 ultra wide. So you're going to have a really bad time attacking up. With a fungal, that becomes super easy. So whenever I'm looking at my money, I'll think about the ratio of my money. If I have more gas than minerals, infestors spend that a bit better than ultras do. And they also allow you to make that endgame push.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that was a very basic LingBaneMuta progression. Now, one of the rare cases where composition can lose you the game is when you commit super hard to LingBaneMuta, and then suddenly a big tank mine Thor army marches out of the turn base, and you're like, wow, I'm actually dead. Like, maybe you have more army value, maybe you have the economy lead, maybe you have the upgraded lead too, but your fast, fragile units are so bad against mine tank Thor that you still manage to grab a loss from a very victorious position in a lot of ways. So this match, it starts fairly normal, and then with the Overseer Scout, you'll see whether they're committing to a bunch of barracks or a bunch of factories. And if they have a bunch of factories, maybe not going for Bane speed. You can cancel that. I'm a fan of leaving the upgrades to finish for whatever cycle they're on, rather than canceling them. Melee upgrades are just pretty good, kind of like we said. Lings are good units, so making your Lings stronger is good. You can Nidus Lings later on. The melee also benefits Ultras and Broodlords, so you can go with one less ranged upgrade and have melee stuff be a little bit stronger. This is another Hatchcast pool opening. First Overlord flies across, sees the most basic turn opening possible. The 4 Lings defended the Reaper pretty decently. Pull 2 workers off gas with Ling speed. Making 4 Queens. One mistake that I make pretty often is sometimes I'll try and send the drone to take a third a little bit too early. Terran players who are good with their first Reaper know that that's a really big opportunity. A drone that's off creep when Ling speed isn't done is very vulnerable and basically free for them to kill. So if the Reaper is, say, up here in the main, that might be a good time to sneak a drone out even before Ling speed is done. But Queens, like we said, are units that gain value over time and help you with your macro moving forward with creep and injects. So if you can't take a third base, make an extra queen. Or 2. The second Overlord goes to the third base. This, sort of as a reference, is a slightly late third base. Usually if it's taken at this time and on the low ground, it means that they're confident in defending this by virtue of wanting to attack really soon. So if we look in the Terran's main, I haven't scouted this yet. Let's look at my vision. Yeah, all I've seen is the barracks. I haven't scouted the setup here, but based on this third base timing, it's only being started at around 340-ish. There's something going on in the main, some type of aggressive move. So a really good checkpoint, 2 base mineral with about 3 gases, and then make some units. If you're going Roach Ravager, make some Roaches. If you're going Ling Bane, make some Lings and maybe a couple safety Banes. I think this is a Hellion drop, if I remember correctly. So, very tiny Ling run by can delay this base for a long time. This Overlord, placed here for 2 reasons. One reason is you fill vision between yourself and the opponent for air. Another reason is it allows you to advance your creep up this cliff in a very kind of quick and seamless manner. Overlords can be positioned to fill vision and look at stuff, but once your lair is done, there are also advanced points of creep. So this cliff on the map, this cliff by the third, oh my goodness. So many Terran strategies revolve around like a tank here, liberators here, or mines or something, and you just bang, 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 blow up the rocks, blow up your third, blow up your face, and the game is over. It's terrible. So thinking about preempting that and saying, alright, I know this area is incredibly strong for the opponent to control, so I want to open up this area with Lings. I want to establish a forward Overlord that can drop creep, and then once lair is done, you can send out some creep queens up here, and then get really nice control of this big open area before they reach that really dangerous cliff. Queens focus the medevac. These situations are stressful, but that's a really important thing to remember.
Ooh, nice snipe on the medevac, though.
Yeah. Every victory is earned by the mistakes of the opponent. Oh, and then one thing that the opponent could have done better, they saw that I had a bunch of queens kind of near the main. They could have sent the Liberator to the third. That probably would have been a little bit better. But notice the theme here. The theme of a medevac play first, and then a Liberator follow-up. It's so common that it should never surprise you. Basically, as the medevac play is being cleaned up, you say, alright, where's the Liberator? Really good habit to get into. Ah. This was the moment. So it was actually a Sloverlord that I sent into the base. But we can see here right around 6 minutes, I might put that in the notes. 6 minutes after some aggression, the Terran player commits to a bunch of factories rather than barracks, which caused me to deviate from taking Bane speed, canceling that Roachworn Hydroden Infestation Pit for a Roach Hydra Viper transition.
I would think you could be at least a little bit suspicious if they do a Hellion drop rather than a Widowmine drop or a Marine drop, don't you think?
Could be, yeah. It does indicate that they may not have taken Stim early on, since Hellions are not dependent on an upgrade like that. It's a reasonable assessment. So this is a slightly different convergence point, but the economy size is similar. Instead of going for 3.5 base mineral with 5 gases, I just droned up to all my gases, since mech armies are a bit slower, moving across the map, with a really fast Hive, and then ranged upgrades, +1 range, +2 armor, Hydra range and speed, 4th base, and then when Hive finishes, I'll make as many Vipers as I can afford. So usually, when you're reacting to, like, you've recently scouted mech, you're not going to be able to have, like, luxury Vipers just pop out 5. That would be great, but starting off with 2 is pretty good. I made a couple Banes early, so I just dropped them. The opponent ended up being good. The Hydralisk is kind of an interesting unit in the ZvT matchup. Roach Hydra isn't really played anymore against Bio, mainly because of Liberators. Liberators outrange Hydras and kill them in one hit. But Hydras are really good supporting units for Broodlords. And Broodlords are the main killing unit against Terran bases in the late game, because they can siege them from far away. Hydras also outrange mines, so you can clean up mines before they trigger, assuming they don't walk into you. And they also trade better with tanks than Roaches do. With your Viper Micro, I didn't mention this. So, Viper Micro, pull single tanks, blind clusters of units. At this stage, after the nerf to Parasitic Bomb, I don't even really feel great about Parasitic Bombing units that much. If they have ground units, like say, for example, instead of this Thor, they had like 5 Vikings, I would say that Blinding Cloud is better than Parasitic Bomb. Pretty much all the time, unless they're pure air. Keeping Overseers alive is important. 2 to 3 with your army all the time is a pretty good benchmark. At moments like these, it can be sort of tempting to press into the opponent, but Roach Hydra really isn't great at sieging locations. So kind of just using this army to control this high ground as a staging area for a Broodlord attack a little bit later. Nidus Network is something that I covered in the YouTube analysis video of LingBaneMuta. Once both players are on 5 bases, usually they'll start to entrench themselves and add more and more defense at the main attack lane. This is the main attack lane, this match. I can't ping for some reason. So if you think about how the opponent is concentrating their forces, pretty much all of their stuff is fighting over the main attack lane, which means Nidus-based attacks would do extremely well, places like here. Their natural is very vulnerable, and the main is vulnerable too. Sun Tzu said, "Sally out where he does not expect you." Nidus allows her to do that. Ah, thank you, Snap. In replays, you may only ping the map when the vision is set to everyone. Let's do a test. It worked. Let's go to Raze's vision. It didn't work. Confirmed. Thanks, Snap.
Ooh, I've been confused by that for ever since Legacy of the Void came out. Thanks, Snap.
So, one thing to think about, I've seen a lot of pro players kill off units when they're trying to trade out, like roaches and stuff. I'm really much in favor of, like, letting them do some stuff, like maybe go on a quest or some shit. Like, this group here, a queen, 3 hydras, 2 roaches, and a ravager. They would much rather, like, be Nidus'd into a Terran third base and wreck some shit before they die, than, like, be focused down by their own army. Like, that's just mean. So, maybe think twice before killing your own roaches with broodlords. Be like, hey, could you go kill some shit somewhere? I mean, we're not gonna save you, but go get him. Like, that makes a roach happy.
Worthy of Valhalla.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Roach, you know Valhalla? Yeah. You want to go? Yeah, okay.
I mean, forcing the lift and getting the tech labs is definitely worth.
Yeah. And it also pulls their attention too, which was one of the main things we talked about in the direct and indirect forces class, which was, even if you don't necessarily deal damage at a given location with some harassment, a lot of times you can use that harassment to pull their focus away from the main fight in the main attack lane, so they aren't quite as on point with their micro and reaction time.
Yeah, if he'd have been paying attention to the gold base, he probably wouldn't be dead right now.
Yeah. It's also tough for a defending player against Nidus to know exactly how much is going to come out of the Nidus. There's a good friend, Enigma. He calls a Nidus a hell portal because he has no idea how many evil swarmy things are going to come out of it. It could be a fake Nidus with absolutely nothing even in it. Or it could be the entire Zerg army, except air units. So yeah, this was basically starting with LingBaneMuta, identifying a mech transition, and then going for something that does better against mech than LingBaneMuta. Hell portal.
So, quick question. What do we do if, after the mech transition, after the stage of the game where things have already gotten ugly on the center base, they transition into something like ghosts?
So, ghosts are, and cyclones also, are interesting units in that they counter pretty much all of Zerg's tier 3 units, but they do horribly against the lowest tech units. So, LingBane wrecks Ghost really hard. So, kind of going back to the thing we mentioned about how Lings are just really cost-effective units over the course of the game in general, even if you're making Ultras or making Broodlords or making Vipers, mixing in Lings is a really good way to round off your composition and act as a buffer against Ghost. Public service announcement, Terran players will confirm this. A Ghost, when it's channeling Snipe, if it takes damage, it will stop channeling Snipe. Lings are really fast, so if Lings rush up to the Ghost and just bite them in the face one time, the Ghost will stop channeling Snipe. So Lings would be the counter unit to a Ghost transition, which is a bit counterintuitive. My opponent's making late game units. Time to make the most basic unit. That'll be good.
Yeah, I lost like a 30-minute game to a bunch of Ghosts the other day. It was really sad.
Happens to the best of us.
And the worst of us. Now for an actual LingBaneMuta game against Bio on the same map. Can you escape from Ghost Snipe? Yes, you can run away, or escape as you put it, but you have to run pretty far distance. It's a long range. I mean, it is a snipe after all.
I think doesn't it work the same way the Cyclone lock-on does? It can hit from a longer range and it can be targeted.
Yeah, I believe so. I'm not sure if vision is required to complete it. Maybe someone knows.
My understanding is that once you start channeling it, as long as you can still see it, you can shoot it.
Mm-hmm. Alright, so this game I open slightly differently. The opponent, I believe... Yeah, they went for Reactor first on their barracks, and they skipped a Reaper. A couple things to mention about this. If they skip the Reaper, that means you don't really need a big Ling escort, and you don't need to wait for speed to take your third. So that's the advantage you can take against a Reactor opener, as opposed to a Reaper opener. Faster third base, you can delay your second and third queens and make those after. One thing to be mindful of is those pesky stim medivac timings arrive a lot sooner. Hellbat timings arrive sooner by virtue of them making some Marines that will scale up with the upgrades and with the medivac, as opposed to Reaper. Blinding Cloud does interrupt the Ghost channeling snipe. Fear Dragon is great. He goes where no one except for like one person has gone before, and then reports back the results. Basically the Star Trek of the StarCraft scene. So rip. This attack, just to kind of go back in time to Heart of the Swarm, was one of the most standard openers for the reason that if you press the opponent in two places, you double their opportunities to fuck up. This is the Marine drop in the main, Hellion drive-by at the third base. It's icky to deal with. You basically have to have enough Lings to clean up the Hellions, and then kind of use Queens to buy time for your Lings to beat the Medivac drop. But the weakness of it is it's fairly low economy. Usually they're going to be delaying their upgrades a bit, like they're starting engineering base after, and then the third, kind of like before, is a little bit on the late side. So clean up the attack and then redrone your losses as soon as you can, right after that. And with that earlier third base, that's a little bit more feasible. It's already injected, good to go. And then again, like 3 Lings killing the SCV, and then canceling the base. That's very good for Zerg. This area is not as good. I tried to do something cool here where you have one mine shoot the other mine. Didn't quite work out because Hellbats.
Fucking Hellbats.
Hellbats. One thing to note is getting up to around 5 gases to make your LingBaneMuta is a bit safer than going for that 6th gas. It just sort of relates to the time that big turn aggression kicks in. If you go for those extra 4 drones, so 1 drone to build the extractor, 3 drones to fill it, you just feel weaker going into the main fights, and you have more Spire units. I kind of prefer having more Lings, just because they're faster. Lings are more versatile in that they can take a main fight, but they can also counterattack really effectively. And by making Lings, it also frees up your ability to spend gas elsewhere, so taking a bit faster Hive or 2-2 if you need to.
So, is the magical counter for the fourth base, fourth base or fifth base, like where they'll set down 2 planetaries next to each other? Do we just tech into Broodlords for that, or do we deal with that with just a lot of flames, or what's
Broodlord and Nidus. Generally, you wouldn't ever attack a planetary unless it's something like Sky Terran and you have a bunch of Corruptors, or you're ready to go with like Ultras or Broodlords. Mainly you want to have tier 3 units, but then kind of how I finished the opponent in the mech game, doing a Nidus attack with a small squad of fighting units, and then pushing one of those outer bases at the same time. Generally one of those 2 things will be successful. But yeah, like 10 Broodlords is a good amount to kind of snowball a push in a way that they can't just stim under you. And then you can have Queens, Corruptors. LingBane is also good support for Broodlords against Bio. Kind of like you were mentioning with the Ghosts. If you just have naked Broodlords, that's not like unclothed Broodlords, but Broodlords without support, they can snipe them and kill them really easily. Or stim a bunch of Marines under them and kill them. But if you have LingBane, they will die as soon as they do that. So this game... Go for it.
Sorry. I was going to say, if you have a ton of gas banked up and don't need it for tech, a bunch of banelings can one-shot a planetary too.
Yep, you can do that. It's not generally cost-effective. That would be sort of something you could do if you felt super far ahead.
Yeah.
Because you're trading gas for minerals, and on the maps, gas is much more precious and scarce than minerals are. So to take that trade is basically you saying, I'm so far ahead that I don't want to put up with your bullshit for much longer. I'm just going to trade these banes for a planetary. It can be done, and it will continue to be done. And maybe some players deserve it.
It's very satisfying, if nothing else.
Yeah. And that's a big part of why we play this game. It's pretty satisfying to beat someone at RTS. Day 9, called the Orange Quartet. 3/3 ground upgrades, adrenal glands, and chitinous plating. Those tier 3 melee ground upgrades. One of the main strengths of LingBaneMuta as opposed to Roach Ravager and Fester is usually you hit that tier 3 transition with a bit more momentum. There are some players like Firecake and Nurchio who basically make their game plan about hitting Ultra as fast as possible, but they cut a lot of corners to get there, and usually they cut some of their melee upgrades. So it's not quite as powerful of a Hive transition, but it's an earlier one. What upgrades did I take on the hair? I took 1/1. Rip the Nidus. In big fights like this, there can be a lot going on. Generally, you want to pre-split your army if you can, get a flanking angle, and then control-click your Banes and make sure they connect with Marines or Hellbats or something that's light. Or if you're Nesty, if Nesty is watching, you need to connect them with a Thor. basically Day 9's transition away from StarCraft was related to the amount of time it took him to make a Day 9 daily, as opposed to a Hearthstone daily or kind of working on his own stuff. The Day 9 brand is very big, so that takes up a lot of time on its own, just keeping up with the community. And then he's also, I think, completed grad school. I may be wrong on that. But I think he finished grad school, and he's made his own game. So StarCraft, I feel like, isn't something that he dislikes, or he chose to not engage in because he wasn't having fun with it, so much as there aren't enough hours in the day to do all the things that you want to do in life. And sometimes you have to cut something out, even if it's something that you like.
And StarCraft is fucking hard.
Yeah. It's hard, and a lot of the time that you spend playing StarCraft don't feel immediately rewarding and satisfying. Like, the losing streak would be a really good example. Another point of pressure for content creators is keeping up with their ability in the game, like trying to stay good in a way that viewers feel like they're a respectable person to watch. It can kind of become obvious when someone backslides a little bit, their fundamentals slip, they lose the timings that they normally beat, and I would wager that you get less of that in Hearthstone.
Because Hearthstone, easy game.
There's some variance involved. It's a game you can play when you're sitting on the toilet, put it that way.
I knew I should have added a kappa.
What is NN? What is that?
I'm not sure. I think that's Russian text. I don't know what it means. Maybe there's a viewer who knows how to interpret that. That coded message. Hearthstone is the reason you're barely mad ever anymore. It's really good for people to cross-train. If you focus all of your energy and effort on one game, it seems like it'll pretty much always disappoint you in some ways. It's good to have a game too, something that you can play when you aren't feeling on top of your stuff. You're just not as rested, you're feeling slower, you had a stressful day or whatever. Hearthstone is great for that. There's a lot of overlap with poker too, variance in probability, and kind of seeing the range of how well or poorly a situation could go for you. So this game, I go for the gasless build as the opener. I actually muck up the build pretty badly. I haven't practiced this in a while. I used to do it every game against Terran, but I've been practicing gas openers more recently. But still managed to get ahead and take some advantages. Build orders don't need to be perfect. Generally they're optimized for a good reason, but with opponent harassment, you should expect them to be mucked up a little bit.
Now, when Telia first went over this build with us, I think she took a third hatchery at around 20 supply. Is there a reason you don't do that?
It wasn't in the notes that I had from her. Maybe I just forgot. But yeah, I could definitely see how that could be squeezed in, especially on a map like this. Yeah, because now the window has closed for the Reaper.
Yeah, now that
to
the
harass.
Reaper's here.
Oh, that's good. I'll actually add that into the notes. Thank you.
I've got my own notes I can send to you if you want.
Dang. Okay, so 20 supply hatch.
Yeah.
That seems legit. We'll go with that. So notice 8 lings were made at the beginning. Gasless is more economical than opening with gas, so you can afford a couple extra lings. I put 3 minutes for the first gas and then 3:30 for 2 other ones. I just took 2 gases whenever, and then a third gas. Mainly it's keeping up your production and the convergence points that matter. If your gas timings are late, that means that basically your progression and your ability to kill the opponent is also late, but you're not exactly at immediate risk of dying because of that type of mistake.
Right. I think in the build I have, it's just 2 gases at 3:30, layer, bane nest, then speed.
Snoot has talked about this as well, in that build orders aren't exactly the most important part of a match. Generally, they'll influence the early game in some way, and someone can take some small advantages, but the player with the better fundamentals is usually going to still find a way to get ahead in most scenarios. Like, you could open with this gasless opener, you could open with a solid opener, or the aggressive opener, and where you fall in the ladder is more a product of your basic Zerg skills than it is just getting build order wins. A lot of people in the community will complain, I think, way too much about build order wins and losses. It does happen, but I think a lot less than most people will claim.
And remember, kids, the faster you stutter step, the more you win.
Yeah, there is such a thing as over microing your units. That's a problem that I see a lot in around like Gold and Platinum League. Say it's a player who played a MOBA game, and maybe they were good at this MOBA game. They were good at microing, they were good at casting their abilities and stuff. And when they come over to StarCraft, they see that fights with armies are also very important. But often, the fight is only a factor in the course of the engagement. A lot of success in StarCraft comes from being able to make units while the fight is occurring. So, keeping an eye on the production tab all the time. Casters and commentators will sometimes mention this. You'll notice, even at the pro level, sometimes you'll see a player who's producing like 8 different things at a given time, and one player is only producing 2 or 3. It's not immediate strength, but it means that the player is progressing on more fronts at that moment that they'll be able to benefit from later. So like right now, I have a creep tumor going, a hatchery that's building, macro hatch, 5 overlords, which means I'll be able to make more units, 10 banes to get some splash damage, and then +2 air attack. So my spire units are going to be stronger. What else could I take? Could I take overload speed? I could take burrow right now. With this gasless and then carapace focused approach, the mutas are more like a direct fighting force rather than medivac cleanup duty.
That's why I really like this style in ZvT.
Yeah. With this approach, even if they transition to Liberator, if you have decent spread of your mutas and you have a good sense of how many Liberators are actually fighting you at a given time, you can still beat Liberators if you have an armor upgrade advantage with your mutas. Low-hanging fruit is a good mental mantra whenever you're going around and harassing. Rather than planning to go for some area in particular, just kind of probing the outside of the opponent's territory and seeing if there's anything kind of hanging low for free that you can kill. Another aspect to the bio versus LingBane dynamic is a lot of times when a Terran player intends to move out, they're like, alright, I've got a bunch of Marines, I've got a bunch of tanks, got a bunch of medivacs. I'm going to go attack the opponent. A lot of times mentally, this means that they're going to be focusing on their army once they get to your side of the map. But when they're on their side of the map, they'll just be maybe going back to their macro. Let's actually go back and look at their vision. It's really interesting, the dynamic between opponent attention and the outcome of engagements based on where they're looking. Because the better army can lose if they're not paying attention at the moment the engagement begins. So we'll go to the Terran's vision. They're moving out. They killed some mutas. Took a fourth. No, they were looking at that.
Somebody didn't spend enough time in Marine Split Challenge.
Yeah. You could pre-split the army a bit more. I mean, they're a barcode. Give them the benefit of the doubt and say maybe they're playing from Australia server or something.
Yeah. Having more Marauders would probably be helpful for him here, too.
Yeah. If you look at their gas expenditure, though, they made a ton of tanks, which really cuts into the Marauder production. And their gases at the third were pretty late.
And he's still floating a ton of it.
This is a really, really common leak for master and like mid to low GM Terran players. A lot of times they'll kind of follow a build and they'll make bio that's mostly marine and they won't think about how to spend that gas. So liberators would be one way to spend it. Mixing in ghosts would allow you to deal with the ultra transition a lot better. Thors are pretty good all around. Thors spend gas. They do well against muta, they do well against ultra. They're still very much on a tier 2 composition. Marine mine medevac tank.
It's interesting that he has the gas to get +3 armor for his bio, and he doesn't.
Yeah, it may have been just when the attack was taken, the opponent didn't have enough for the armor, so they're kind of like, I'm gonna try and kill bases, focus more on any of the game. The +3 armor doesn't really help them very much, kind of in this scenario where they're trying desperately to kill an ultra player.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Upgrades are very much things that pay off more the longer the game goes. So if they're not really making that many ghosts and they're not making that many liberators and they're really trying to kill bases and win, then upgrades are going to suit them less effectively than just making more army. Ultras are good. For a more shorthand approach, I know I can be kind of verbose sometimes. For a matchup, if you're just lost, go to a stream where a player of that race is streaming against your race. So, say a Villo is streaming and he's facing a Zerg. Basically, get a pen and paper, and all the stuff that he complains about, that's what you build. And it's going to be pretty effective. He'll say that it's imbuff, but really it's just how you should approach the matchup.
You're sending him to a Villo stream? Are you trying to deforest the entire planet?
The guy's a magician. I'm a big Avila fan.